Might have a couple of absences. We'll see who comes in a few minutes late. Next week we'll be shifting gears. We'll be turning to Brecht. And the main reading for us next week will be Benjamin's essay, What is Epic Theater? And I think that I mentioned to you guys previously that we do have a primary source. We have a Brecht play to look at, and that's Baal. And that's Brecht's first play. And so it's atypical, but it's also typical, meaning there is continuity there. Between Brecht's early work and his later work. Benjamin will be focusing very similarly to what we're doing with Kafka. Benjamin will be discussing things that we're not reading as our primary text. So Brecht's Baal, and then Eric Bentley's introduction to Baal, which is worthwhile. And we also have another primary piece of writing by Brecht, Theater for Learning, which kind of lays out Brecht's philosophy. So we've talked around Proust, and then now we'll come back to it with Kafka. Even though we looked at the stories rather than the novels, we will discuss Brecht as a novelist, as a kind of a failed novelist. We have been talking about the novel as a form, the bourgeois novel particularly, and the relationship between the bourgeois novel and the modernist novel. So the modernist novel is a crisis of the bourgeois novel. So we'll be shifting now into the realm of drama, stage drama, dramaturgy, plays. And of course this is an ancient form, going all the way back to classical antiquity. We have Aristotle's Poetics, which explains the form of the tragedy specifically. And we have in between, we have Shakespeare. We have Shakespearean tragedy, which is different. It's kind of the bourgeois tragedy as opposed to the ancient tragedy. I think that we've talked about that also to some degree. And now we're going to be dealing with drama as a modernist phenomenon. So recall that one of the things that we're trying to address in the course is Benjamin's approach to modernism and how it's different from other Marxists of his time. So he's looking specifically at bourgeois decadence, modernism, and the decadence in particular. So Proust is a decadent, Baudelaire is a decadent, Kafka now is a decadent. Kafka, who Brecht said represented Jewish fascism. Brecht said that Kafka represented Jewish fascism. We're going to think about what that might mean. So there is a sort of an implicit dialogue going on with Benjamin's writings on these authors, on their works. So the dialogue is with other Marxists who have a very negative attitude regarding them. So Marxists are very negative about Proust, very negative about Kafka, very negative about Baudelaire. And so there's a lot implicit here about what Benjamin is arguing against. But to people at the time, it would have been obvious that Benjamin is taking a very different position and making a antithetical case to the usual Marxist approach. So any volunteers for next time for the Brecht week? Like I said, the main reading being What is Epic Theater? Brecht, by the way, is going to make another appearance later in the semester when we read Benjamin's Conversations with Brecht, which are in Reflections. But we've situated the Conversations with Brecht, more as background for the Arcades project because of the number of different things that they discuss, the two of them, because it's really, the Conversations with Brecht are more about Benjamin and Brecht talking as Marxists in the era of Stalinism, things going on at the time, rather than, there's some discussion there of Brecht's own work, but not enough to sort of overload our week. So any takers on Brecht, on Benjamin on Brecht, to be more specific. Do you guys know Brecht at all? Is Brecht a thing anymore? Have you ever seen a Brecht play? Have people seen Brecht plays? No, not so much.
Mother Courage.
Mother Courage, yeah, that's a good one. Absolutely.
I read an abridged version in our language. One thing.
It's an experience. It can be.
Yeah.
Have any of you seen Beckett performed? Beckett?
Yes.
I think Beckett.
Yes.
Yes, Beckett is like a kind of opposite case to Brecht, and yet there are a lot of similarities, in fact. There are a lot of similarities. Brecht, of course, predates Beckett, and Beckett is not a thing when Benjamin's writing, so it's post-World War II. It's Adorno who draws a parallel between Brecht and Beckett. Okay, no volunteers, no takers, Brecht. Benjamin Brecht. And this is like very central to Benjamin because unlike Kafka and Proust, Brecht is a personal friend of Benjamin. Is it, what are we in week 7 next week? Does that mean like midterms? Is there some like lining up of the planets and the moons and the stars to mitigate?
We have to do it twice, is it?
Twice, yes. Twice, thrice. One too many Vietnams.
I'll do it. I'll do it 2 weeks in a row. Let's go.
Oh, all right, Danny. Okay, that's one. Boom. Okay, get it over with.
No, I mean like I did this week, so I'll do this
Okay,
week too.
yeah.
I've done
Okay. Okay. You've been posting pretty regularly anyway to the discussion threads. Okay, cool. You guys, great. Right. So, all right. So let's first of all bring up our Benjamin. This is the one without the table of contents, I think. Small about the table of contents. Reflection says table of contents. Illumination is not. Very unfortunate. Oh yeah, it is earlier. So we've got 2 essays by Benjamin on Kafka. We've got Franz Kafka on the 10th anniversary of his death, and then we've got some reflections on Kafka, which is basically a letter. Not like a standalone essay per se. And we'll see that Benjamin does, with the opening, he does a little Kafkaesque little performance, right? So we have the Berlin Chronicle as Benjamin's Proustian performance, and then we have the Potemkin analogy, or parable that he begins this essay with. It is related that Potemkin suffered from states of depression, which recurred more or less regularly. So you guys know who Potemkin was? You know what a Potemkin village is? No? Okay, so Catherine the Great is the Tsarina. She's the empress. She's like she's in charge. And she's an enlightened despot, so enlightened despotism. And, all right, sorry for the digression, but I have to, I guess. So the period of the 1600s and the 1700s and going back to the 1500s, so going back to Henry VIII in Britain, and then later we've got Louis XIV in France, and then we've got Frederick the Great at the time of Kant in the late 1700s, the era of enlightened despotism, the era of absolutism. So absolutism. Absolutism is when the king puts themselves above the church and the aristocracy. And they do so in alliance with the bourgeoisie. So it's a phenomenon of the rise of the bourgeoisie after the late Middle Ages, after the Renaissance, and in the era of the Protestant Reformation especially. So Henry VIII, we know, was dealing with the Protestant Reformation. And it took the form of him breaking the church from Rome and establishing like a kind of quasi-Protestantized Catholic Church, Anglicanism. But so it's otherwise the king was from among the aristocracy and the church was above, right? So it's also about the rise of the modern state in a particular way, although we're going to be dealing with another aspect of the state in the era of capitalism. So the so-called enlightened despots are trying to modernize their countries. So Frederick the Great is one, Catherine the Great is another. And it's different though, so they're not able to do, and Catherine the Great of course was advised by Voltaire. Voltaire was hired by Catherine the Great to come and advise her, which is a bizarre, if you just think about it, Voltaire, Candide, Professor Pangloss, right? Like how strange is this? So there's the sort of Eastern example, Catherine the Great. The Western example would be Henry VIII, Louis XIV. And then there's Germany, Frederick the Great, which is sort of in between. And then, of course, there's this other thing, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right, which is where Kafka is from. Right, so they're not able to do what Henry VIII and Louis XIV were able to do in Western Europe. Right, so it's a little bit more artificial, and so we have the notion of the Potemkin village as a dramatic illustration of the artificial character of absolutism in the East. They're not able to modernize because, of course, modernity is based on bourgeois society. It can't just be imposed from above by the state. It has to actually come out of the social relations. And so Russia and Austro-Hungarian Empire are relatively backward in comparison to Prussia and let alone France and the UK. So Potemkin is, her chief of staff, her main guy, and she's like, we need to build up Russia. And so, of course, he's unable to do this. So instead he creates Potemkin villages. And, so we know that idea, but have we ever thought of the figure of Potemkin? In other words, what would it mean to be in charge of a kind of quasi-feudal aristocratic bureaucracy of a sprawling empire who's being told by the empress, we got to build up Russia, we want to modernize things. And he's just like, okay, I guess we can try that. Right, it might make you depressed. It might make you manic, it might make you depressed. Right, like so there's like a manic character, we've been talking about this, like mania being the flip side of depression. Like the Potemkin village, so she would take her carriage to inspect, right? And see the progress of building up these villages, and so you just have the facades of buildings, right? And so you get this sense of like, well, surely she knew that it was just the facade of buildings. No, she's like speeding through, right? So barely able to see what's going on. So the manic character of it, but of course the person who's actually responsible for it, Potemkin, the depressive character of it. Because he's just some aristocratic guy, so is that was his goal in life to be a bourgeois modernizer of a backward country? No. Right? He probably wanted to do duels and sleep with women. And, he didn't want to be in charge of modernizing Russia. No. So it's depressing. It is related that Potemkin suffered from states of depression, which occurred more or less regularly. At such times, no one was allowed to go near him, and access to his room was strictly forbidden. This malady was never mentioned at court, and in particular it was known that any allusion to it incurred the disfavor of the Empress Catherine. One of the Chancellor's depressions lasted for an extraordinary length of time and brought about serious difficulties. In the offices, documents piled up that required Potemkin's signature, and the Empress pressed for their completion. The high officials were at their wits' end. So notice what's being pressed for completion is just the signing of documents. the actual doing of anything. So again, if your only job is to sign documents, that's depressing. The high officials were at their wits' end. One day, an unimportant little clerk named Shivalkin happened to enter the anteroom of the chancellor's palace and found the counselors of state assembled there, moaning and groaning as usual. "What's the matter, your excellencies?" asked the obliging Shivalkin. They explained things to him and regretted that they could not use his services. "If that's all it is," said Shivalkin, "I beg you to let me have those papers." Having nothing to lose, the counselors of state let themselves be persuaded to do so. And with the sheaf of documents under his arm, Shivalkin set out through galleries and corridors for Potemkin's bedroom. Without stopping or bothering to knock, he turned the door handle. The room was not locked. In semi-darkness, Potemkin was sitting on his bed in a threadbare nightshirt, biting his nails. Shivalkin stepped up to the writing desk, dipped a pen in ink, and without saying a word, pressed it into Potemkin's hand while putting one of the documents on his knees. Potemkin gave the intruder a vacant stare. Then, as though in his sleep, he started to sign. First one paper, then a second, finally all of them. When the last signature had been affixed, Shivalkin took the papers under his arm and left the room without further ado, just as he had entered it. Waving the papers triumphantly, he stepped into the anteroom. The counselors of state rushed toward him and tore the documents out of his hands. Breathlessly, they bent over them. No one spoke a word. The whole group seemed paralyzed. Again, Shivalkin came closer and solicitously asked why the gentleman seemed so upset. At that point, he noticed the signatures. One document after another was signed. Shivalkin, Shivalkin, Shivalkin. This story is like a herald racing 200 years ahead of Kafka's work. The enigma which beclouds it is Kafka's enigma. The world of offices and registries of musty, shabby, dark rooms is Kafka's world. The obliging Shivalkin, who makes light of everything and is finally left empty-handed, is Kafka's K, or Joseph K. Potemkin, who vegetates, somnolent and unkempt in a remote, inaccessible room, is an ancestor of those holders of power in Kafka's works, who live in the attics as judges or in the castle as secretaries. No matter how highly placed they may be, there are always fallen or falling men. Although even the lowest and seediest of them, the doorkeepers and the decrepit officials, may abruptly and strikingly appear in the fullness of their power. Why do they vegetate? Could they be the descendants of the figures of Atlas that support globes with their shoulders? Perhaps that is why each has his head so deep on his chest that he can hardly see his eyes, though one can hardly see his eyes. Like the Castellan in his portrait, or a clam when he is alone. But it is not the globe they are carrying, it is just that even the most commonplace things have their weight. His fatigue is that of a gladiator after the fight, his job with the whitewashing of a corner in the office. Georg Lukács once said that in order to make a decent table nowadays, a man must have the architectural genius of a Michelangelo. If Lukács thinks in terms of ages, Kafka thinks in terms of cosmic epochs. The man who whitewashes has epochs to move, even in his most insignificant movement. On many occasions, and often for strange reasons, Kafka's figures clap their hands, once the casual remark is made that these hands are really steam hammers. Okay. So, what's going on here? So we're going to have later with the Arcades project an image of the unemployed Hercules, right? And so this is like the gladiator who has to whitewash walls. Sort of mismatch between ancient heroism and modern life, which is a kind of purposeless kind of activity. It's kind of busy work. And really the issue then is bureaucracy. Okay, bureaucracy. And bureaucracy as a modern phenomenon as opposed to as an ancient phenomenon. So when we say Kafkaesque, we mean these sort of Byzantine bureaucracies, sort of unfathomable, impenetrable, sort of decrepit things that nonetheless have power over us. Right, so it seems like an inheritance from the ancient world, but is actually a very modern phenomenon. Meaning it's a phenomenon of capitalism. Nonetheless, there is this idea of the hydraulic empires, right? So what's a hydraulic empire? This is a language that Benjamin uses in talking about Kafka and the world that he describes. Hydraulic empires are like China, in certain respects India. It goes back to ancient Rome in a particular sense. So why are there these bureaucracies and what do they represent? He invoked Lukács. So Lukács wrote about bureaucracy, and Lukács was an acolyte of Max Weber, who was a German sociologist who also wrote a great deal about bureaucracy. Weber had this idea of the iron law of bureaucracy, meaning that as societies develop, they become more bureaucratic. But he also thought there was something specific about the West and its bureaucratization and capitalism that involved a means-ends reversal, meaning that the bureaucrats are there to serve a purpose, but then they become an end in themselves. In other words, they're there only to maintain their position, not to actually serve their social function. Okay, so with the hydraulic empires, what is that about? It's about these complex canals, aqueducts, right? It's about distributing water for subsistence agriculture. And how there are these rules in place regarding the peasants, regarding the countryside, that come from the centralized authority, and everyone has to obey the rules, or on punishment, on pain of death, they can't divert water from the canals, right? So everything is, the reason is that if peasants in one area divert water, then it will affect people miles away, hundreds of miles away maybe. Right? It will be a disaster for people down the system. And that therefore what you have is this kind of system of rules, this structure, but the people inhabiting it don't know what its actual purpose is. So that's the idea. The idea is that they are dependent on this structure in this system, but it's completely opaque to them. They have no idea why it's there, what purpose it serves. So there's a disjunction between means and ends. What takes place? So bureaucracy is an example of this. It's the means that become an end in itself. So the means are meant to serve an end, but they become an end in itself. And according to Lukács, this happened in capitalism, but not simply in the Weberian sense of things that are a means to an end become an end in themselves, but rather in the sense of the end is actually capital. Right, so it's in service to capital. So things become a means for capital. And capital is, of course, understood as an alienated society. Right, so this is, I don't know if we've talked about Lukács reification. We have, I think you have, yeah, we have. Right, so reification is a way of describing alienation. So it's when the subject-object dialectic breaks down and you get a reversion to the thing in itself. Right, so the thing is something that we've produced, but it seems to take on a life of its own and exist in and for itself rather than for us. So that's what Benjamin is introducing here, which is Potemkin is a functionary. Right? That's another word that we have, like a functionary. But then the question is, function for what purpose? And And then he's got another term, which is the attendance. Right, so Marx famously described the situation in industrial capitalism where the worker is no longer producing things, but is just superintending the machine, is attending to the machine. Right, and that the machine goes from being a tool to being a kind of a character with a life of its own. It's kind of a subject. And capital becomes an automatic subject. That's Marx's language. So capitalism is about society being dominated by the automatic subject of capital. But of course, people can also exhibit this quality. Right, so I think that I mentioned that with Kafka and Brecht, the thought figure that Benjamin is introducing is action becoming an image. Action becomes an image of itself, where it seems like the image is the purpose of the action. So when action loses its purposeful character, then it becomes an image. Now, all of this, we've been setting it up now for the last few weeks, but really the issue is what would the critique of reification be? Or how to make reification critical in the sense of pointing beyond itself. How does it point beyond itself? Rather than reification being a dead end. So that brings us back to Weber, right? Lukács's mentor, who basically thought that capitalism is a dead end. That capitalism had this kind of inevitable logic that became a dead end for humanity. And similarly, Heidegger later arrives at the same kind of idea. And in both cases, they're inspired by Nietzsche. And I think last week we talked about Nietzsche. We talked about the Overman and the Last Man. Did we talk about that? Yes. That the specter of the last man is that humanity just ends up kind of in this dead end. And so Nietzsche thought that this kind of nihilistic place that modern humanity had ended up in was like its greatest crisis ever, and that showed the possibility and necessity of the Overman, right? Because surely we're not going to end up as the last man, right? We're going to overcome, yeah? No, evidently not, right? We're still in capitalism. Right, so of course Benjamin's understanding of this, following from Lukács, is that Weber and then later Heidegger, who's not really on the map here, yet, but that they had sort of taken the wrong lesson from Nietzsche. That Nietzsche, the call for the Overman, could in fact be understood as the call for socialism. Oh, even though Nietzsche himself thought that socialism was an example of the last man. In other words, Weber, Heidegger, Nietzsche, in his own understanding, thought that socialism was a kind of ratification of this dead end rather than an overcoming of the dead end. Right, so remember, everything that Benjamin is writing, every word on the page is about socialism. That's the socialism, communism, let's do this. Right? That's why his friends with Brecht. And so Kafka seems to be this kind of depressing figure telling us about the meaninglessness of life and how everything's like a dead end and there's an infinite amount of hope, but not for us, right? And Benjamin's like, yeah, well, let's understand that from a socialist perspective. Like, in other words, is this a description of capitalism? It is. Whereas Brecht, I mentioned, thinks it's Jewish fascism. What does that mean? So what is the left's critique of the right? Do you guys know what the left's critique of the right is? No, in our world, we can't really apprehend this stuff at all. We're just totally gone. It's totally gone. The left thinks that the right is too pessimistic. The left thinks that the right has a pessimistic view of human nature and society. The left is optimistic, the right is pessimistic. It might be reversed now. It might be reversed now. The left might be pessimistic and the right might be optimistic in a really crazy way. But no, very basic. Brecht doesn't like Kafka because it's pessimistic. Because Kafka doesn't show how we can struggle, how we can overcome. So their understanding of fascism and the right in general, that fascism is part of the right, it's peculiar because the fascists have their own kind of mania quality, obviously, is that they're pessimistic. They're kind of foreclosing possibilities. The problem is that they're foreclosing possibilities rather than pursuing them. Right? So the spirit of Benjamin that I have to channel. Try to channel here. Ask any of my colleagues and teachers here at the Art Institute, is socialism possible? They will all say no. I won't necessarily say yes. But I will say that if you think it's impossible, then welcome to the world that we live in. And it's going to continue. It's going to remain Kafkaesque. If you don't think socialism is possible, then you have to have barbarism. Okay, so what does barbarism look like to a wannabe novelist living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire? It looks like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Right? It looks like they had these phrases for these empires. So there was the Prussian Empire, obviously. There's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And believe it or not, Ottoman Empire was considered part of Europe. It's part of this general German world, like the Prussian, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman empires, all they're allies in World War I. They're allies in World War I. Central powers. So the sick man of Europe was the Ottoman Empire, and the old man of Europe was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Right, so Russia and Prussia, not so much, because actually I mentioned, we talked about Second Industrial Revolution? Yeah, we did, okay. So Russia is one of the, in the late 19th, early 20th century, it's actually one of the centers of the Second Industrial Revolution. Austria, not so much. Austria, not. Prussia, yes. Germany, yes. Russia, yes. Italy, to a certain extent. Austro-Hungarian Empire, no. Ottoman Empire, no. So they're the colonial hinterlands of the Prussians, of the Germans in the Second Industrial Revolution. Russia is quasi a hinterland of France. They have their own thing going on. So anyway, all this to say, the old man in Austro-Hungarian Empire. So what does that mean? It means it's this strange relic. And yet, of course, Kafka is a modern person. He's living in the modernity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Like Freud, right, represents this kind of strange Viennese modernity. I will say something about the Judaism. So in Europe, Jews are seen as Eastern. Right, so in Britain, France, Italy, Germany, they're seen as Eastern. Eastern in two senses. Middle Eastern, of course, Semitic people, Middle Eastern people, but also Eastern in this other sense, Eastern Europe, Eastern, Russia. So they're associated with the East in Europe. Now, in Eastern Europe, however, Jews are seen as Western. In other words, they're seen as modernity. Right, so they play a role in Eastern Europe where they are the more modern people in comparison to their surroundings. So in Russia and Austria-Hungary, Jews are moderns as opposed to the backward native peoples. In Western Europe, Jews are seen as backward. Right? That's what it means for them to be Eastern. They're backward. They're holding on to their old customs. Right? From the Middle East. Like, what the hell is that? Right? They're not quite with it. So there is this peculiar position with regard to Austrian or Viennese modernity, and Kafka's part of this. Right, so it puts them ahead in some ways, even though they're backward in other ways. Because when we think about like the modernist era, like turn of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, a disproportionate number of people who proved to be very influential in the 20th century come from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You know, it's like artists, architects, writers, scientists. Like it's pretty remarkable. And so there is this threshold of modernity character, and that's how Benjamin is grasping Kafka. He's taking Kafka as exemplary but not a model. We have that language from the Proust essay. Exemplary but not a model. Exemplary of modernity. Exemplary as a modernist. Okay, so Lukács, we talked about this with Proust. Now we have to return to it with Kafka. Lukács's pre-Marxist writing, the theory of the novel. It's kind of neo-Hegelian writing, the theory of the novel. A little bit romantic also, theory of the novel. Where he ends with two Russian examples. He ends with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, the theory of the novel. And they both represent very different paths out of the crisis of the novel. And for Tolstoy, there's a kind of a terminus. For Lukács, Tolstoy represents a kind of a terminus. And Dostoevsky, Lukács says, is already beyond the novel. So where does Kafka fit in? Kafka comes after both of those. And nonetheless is trying, like Proust, to write a novel, even though in many respects it really bursts the limits of the novel form. So how does it burst the limits of the novel form? And again, why would Brecht have such a visceral reaction against Kafka. Because there's no like hero with a task. There's no like point, There's just this kind of existential despair and futility. And so when we deal with Brecht next time, we're going to be dealing with the fact that Brecht is actually trying to save drama as an art form, as a bourgeois art form. In other words, he's trying to be the Shakespeare of his time. He's not trying to do something else. He's not doing agitprop. He's trying to be the Shakespeare of his time. In other words, he's trying to be a modern dramatist, dramaturge in the era of capitalism. That's really his goal, is to restore drama as a form. And restore it in what respect? Art is supposed to be enlightening. Right, so the idea is art as enlightenment versus art as mystification. And Brecht didn't like Kafka because Kafka mystifies. He doesn't enlighten, he mystifies. And as mystifying, it's like fascism, because fascism doesn't enlighten, it mystifies. Fascism obscures, whereas the task is to clarify. But Benjamin thinks, well, no, actually, Kafka does clarify. What does he clarify? He clarifies the opacity. He clarifies the obscurity. He enlightens us about the limits of enlightenment under capitalism. In other words, the bourgeois desideratum of enlightenment and freedom through enlightenment actually has some problems in capitalism. Capitalism is a formidable obstacle to that. And indeed, it's impossible. The whole point is that it's impossible to do bourgeois enlightenment in capitalism, other than in this perverse way. And that's what makes Kafka exemplary. Because Kafka isn't trying to mystify. He's not trying to. He might end up seemingly mystifying things, but he certainly isn't trying to. And this brings us around to the issue of formalism. So I mentioned that the argument that Benjamin has that's topical is modernism versus socialist realism. So the idea is that socialist realism is enlightening, clarifying, it tells you the task, it heroizes the struggle. Whereas modernism is enervating and mystifying and obscuring, right, and distracting from the task. Benjamin, of course, wants to flip that completely around and say that socialist realism, this attempt at restoring a bourgeois realism, is actually more obscuring, more distracting, more mystifying, whereas modernism is actually more clarifying, more acute in terms of its presentation of the problems and the task. And so it's flipping it completely around. And then we'll see that what Brecht does, Brecht thinks that he's like theater for learning. And Benjamin draws the parallel with Kafka. Oh, actually, Brecht is demonstrating the opacity and the actual mystification of life in capitalism and the futility of action, in fact. It's not agitprop, but it's also not able to restore an enlightenment, clarification, and bourgeois heroism of Shakespeare. Which even Shakespeare is kind of a curious thing. Shakespearean tragedy, like, what kind of a hero is happening? Right. So Benjamin wants to treat Kafka as a legitimate development of the bourgeois novel form that is trying to preserve its desiderata, that is not trying to abdicate on the task of the novel. So with modernism, the idea is to do the same thing, you have to do it differently in capitalism. In other words, to do the novel, to do what the novel is supposed to do, you have to seemingly violate the novel as a form. So Proust, Kafka, I think that I mentioned he wanted to write about Joyce, and Thomas Mann and Faulkner. You know, he had a long list of things to do that he didn't get around to, in which he would have tried to make the case for them as well. Right? Very disparate examples, very disparate examples. Nonetheless, all sharing in common what? Well, the situation of capitalism, and that's why it's not a formal matter. It's not like doing this versus doing that. It isn't. There's something prescriptive about Benjamin. And indeed, Brecht's attempt to be prescriptive is itself symptomatic. So the fact that Brecht thinks that he has a solution actually makes him a more acute symptom of capitalism. Right? That he thinks he's got like a communist answer to the formal problem of art and capitalism. No. He's got a symptom. So that's what Benjamin, he's doing a symptomatic approach to all these writers. So we have to sort of track what kind of a symptom is Kafka, how does Kafka diagnose his own situation, and how does it point beyond? How does it point beyond? Right now, Deleuze and Guattari for a minor literature. The celebration of failure. The celebration of failure. No, the celebration of failure. For minor literature, Kafka. What makes Kafka good is that he's bad? No. No. Just stop. Just stop. Stop with that shit. It's been 60 years of that shit. Since the 60s? No, stop. No. Minor? No. No failure? No. Please no. No. And they took some license from Benjamin for that shit. A great failure. No, it's not. What the emphasis is not on failure. The emphasis is on great, and it is about the attempt. It's about the attempt, and also not about the failure as doing it this way as opposed to doing it that way. It's about the inevitability of failure within capitalism. So modernism has a failed quality to it. That it doesn't mean therefore the lesson is don't try to do bourgeois art anymore. No, you have to, otherwise the failure won't be interesting, it won't be great. It will just be failure, period, lame. Right, so Kafka's not letting you know that it's okay to be lame. No. Now, this brings me around to the point. The novels are lame. The novels are lame. The Trial, The Castle, America, these are not good novels. They're not. They don't work. They do not work. No, they're not good. It's not really like Joyce, actually. It's not at all like Mann. They kind of suck. They don't really work. The short stories work. The short stories definitely work. The novels, not so much. But he didn't want to be a short story writer. He wanted to be a novelist. And the task is different. The task of the short story and the task of the novel are different. And they are bad novels. They don't work. They're these interesting artifacts, but they don't work. Again, exemplary, not a model. But in a different sense now, because Proust, it works. Proust, it works. It does work. Kafka kind of doesn't. So again, we're going to look closely at Kafka's writing through the stories and through the parables, not through the novel. But I wrongly probably assume that maybe you guys have tried to read Kafka's novels. I know I did when I was in high school, because in high school you're like angsty, and you're like, Kafka, yes. Right? And of course, even for someone as old as me, my teachers were like, Kafka is great literature. Right? Kafka was canonized. So when Benjamin is writing about Kafka, Kafka is not canonized. He's not at all canonized. So Kafka becomes canonized, and the canonization is a problem. There's a banalization, kitchification of Kafka. That's bad. That is lame. Right. That's a fate that's different. It's a different kind of problem. We don't have that problem with, again, Proust and Joyce. It's not the same. It's not the same. Like I said, he actually is a great parabolist and short story writer. Like that secures him as a literary figure. And so it shows that there's a problem with the novels that isn't about the form. It's not like he made bad moves and therefore the novels suck. It's about the novel itself. It's about the problem of the novel itself as a form that Kafka gives expression to. So the way he approached it demonstrated something for Benjamin. Okay. What's part of the banalization of Kafka? The Freudian psychoanalysis of Kafka. The Oedipal complex of Kafka, right? The son who is not able to rebel against his father, but is suffering from the authority of the father. So very classic psychoanalytic idea, which is suffering from the superego. So kind of neurosis as a suffering from the superego, where the neurosis as like a failed Oedipus complex, right? So again, banal Freud, banal psychoanalysis, but he has to deal with it. In other words, Benjamin has to address this. He does have to address it as like a plausible reading of Kafka. Like it's plausible, but it's problematical. And guilt, cosmic guilt. So I'll just say something about this. So it's something that we'll follow up on in later weeks' readings, because we will turn to like religion, theology. We will be talking about like Old Testament, whatnot. So why are there children? Do you guys know why there are children at all? Why do children exist? It's punishment. It's punishment. Adam and Eve didn't have children. No. In paradise, there were no children. There's just Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Adam and Eve. There are no children. There's no illness. There's no aging. There's no death. There's no reproduction. Right? Okay, so Old Testament, the Talmud. New Testament. What is the Austro-Hungarian Empire? What is its backwardness in comparison to Prussia? It's Catholic. It's Catholic. Why is Austria not part of Germany? They don't want too many Catholics. They already had too many Catholics. They had Bavaria. So Austro-Hungarian Empire, both Hungary and Austria are Catholic. Catholic monarchies, Catholic. So not Orthodox. They rule over Orthodox. The Balkans are Orthodox and Muslim. Right, so, and then of course, Russia is Orthodox, and Greece is Orthodox, but Greece is under the Ottomans, and then it got its freedom, and blah, 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 right? And the Ottomans are the inheritors of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. And even though it's a Muslim empire, it still is also a Byzantine empire. Austria-Hungary, though, its history is somewhat different. And it's the other side of the Germanic world. So basically you have the Germanic world coming out of the post-Roman era, and you have what's known as the Holy Roman Empire. So the actual inheritor state of the Holy Roman Empire is Austria. Not Prussia, not Germany. It's Austria. Right, so it's a strange alternate center to Rome in terms of the history of Catholicism. Right, but Catholicism is old Christianity as opposed to Protestantism, which is new Christianity. Protestantism is bourgeois Christianity. Catholicism is feudal Christianity. So Catholicism survives in the backward parts of Europe. Right, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. France in a funny kind of way, but that's France has its own peculiarities, and we'll be dealing with that when we get to the Surrealists in particular. Not so much Baudelaire, but the Surrealists as some kind of undigested Catholicism. Yes, it's true. Right? And even what Catholicism means in France, because Catholicism was the enemy of the French Revolution, but Napoleon and then Louis Bonaparte later both sort of bring Catholicism in opportunistically for political reasons. And so there's this funny, like, nominally secular state that makes its peace with the Catholic Church, but in this funny kind of way, where you get a kind of imitation of the old Catholic bureaucracy by the state bureaucracy, by the French state bureaucracy, especially in the university system. So a lot of like structuralism, post-structuralism is an agonized struggle with Catholicism, in fact. Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary. Okay, so why did I bring up Catholicism? Because it's a question of bureaucracy. Question of bureaucracy and the clergy and the traditional authority, and what kind of traditional authority. That it's a bureaucratic traditional authority. It's a bureaucratized traditional authority that seems to have very deep roots in antiquity. Like it kind of goes all the way back. So you don't have even feudalism in the classic way in Eastern Europe that you had in Western Europe in terms of the feudal aristocracy. It's not quite the same situation. That also means that the situation of the peasants is different too. So there's a different kind of, this is the hydraulic empire idea. So Marx has a very controversial notion about history, Asiatic despotism. If you've heard of this category of Marx, Asiatic despotism. So Asiatic despotism is like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other like Oriental, right, Asiatic despotism. As opposed to Greece and Rome, which is classical antiquity, and then that's a different path, via feudalism into the bourgeois era and capitalism. And so that's a kind of Hegelian kind of distinction that Marx nonetheless accepts. So where does Austria-Hungary fit in? It's sort of in between. It's in between Asiatic despotism and Western absolutism, right? So that's, again, Russia would be more on the side of Asiatic despotism, in fact, in terms of a quasi-Asiatic country, like quasi-European, quasi-Asiatic. Like this is, Marxists talked about things in this way. That's the way they used to talk about these things. Like in Kafka's own time, in Benjamin's time. Right, so this has gone out of fashion, especially since the 60s, but no, Benjamin believes it. As a Marxist, he believes it. So it's part of his interpretive apparatus, and it's what he can assume from his readers. He can assume from his readers a certain view of geographical history and social history and how it is present. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire is like a kind of wannabe Western power that isn't. So it's want to be Western in a way that Russia's not. Actually, the Ottoman Empire is kind of want to be Western too, but isn't. So the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire have this affinity, which is that they're kind of want to be Western, but they're not really. But it's not this kind of Russian case, which is different. And by the way, we're still dealing with that. We're still dealing with that. Putin's, big claim is that, it's like Russia is different. All right, so let me bring up your notes and we'll get into it. You've used Microsoft Word before on this computer? Yes. Okay, good. Who were my presenters? Who were the volunteers? You guys. Okay, so how did you guys parse it out? Should you guys go in any particular order of your notes, or?
We were just like working on our own.
Okay.
Yeah, since,
Separate notes.
yeah, since there wasn't like quite as much to cover, we just both kind of wanted to see what our questions were.
Okay, cool. All right, so maybe, Dan, you want to start?
Sure.
You want to focus on?
Okay, well, I think the main question that, there's a lot of things we can touch on, but I think my main curiosity about the two different essays like next to each other. So the first essay talks a lot about theology versus rationalism, and how Kafka is like navigating these two forms of reason, and what his relationship is to the cosmic, and how he's not necessarily like considering himself any kind of prophet, but he is sort of advocating for this like mysticism that brings people together as sort of a larger public that is like connected with something beyond an individual self. So that seems to be where Benjamin is finding like a glimmer of hope, or a potential like utopic value in Kafka's work in the first essay. Then in the letter to Sholem, something seems to switch, and he starts to talk about mysticism in a very different way. Mysticism as sort of like a salve to society, as a way of like dissociating from what's really happening, and that feels really surprising, considering like how much he's devoted to the nuance of it in the first essay. And so I was wondering if there was maybe some context for like what's happened in the time in between these two pieces, or like what he's trying to. It seems like he's warning Sholem about something. He's like, Gershom Sholem, right? He's like a Kabbalist.
Right.
The like modern Kabbalist, right? So he's talking to like the main esoteric, right? Like, so I was curious maybe what has shifted.
Could be the audience itself, because I'm not sure that Benjamin changed his mind. So what we have with the two essays is, what we have to sort of consider is how Benjamin is trying to have a dialectical approach to Kafka. And that doesn't mean like on the one hand, on the other hand, like it's not like some kind of even-handedness. It's more about the contradiction. And so how the theological content of Kafka is dual-edged. So here would be some language from like Marxist ideology critique. So kind of a phrase is, conceals more than it reveals, right? That's like a kind of vulgar Marxist, like criticism of something is. So a vulgar Marxist criticism of Kafka would be that it conceals more than it reveals. Now, for Benjamin, who's more dialectical than that, actually the concealing and the revealing are inseparable. So it's not like you can rate things like, oh, this reveals more than it conceals, whereas this over here conceals more than it reveals. No, the revealing and the concealing are the same operation. It's the same thing. And so the theological character of Kafka has this two sides, right? It's self-contradictory. And so, again, what I was talking about Brecht, which is Brecht does believe in the bourgeois desideratum, and other Marxists do too, and certainly the socialist realists, for sure, of the purpose of art, the task of art, the responsibility of art, social responsibility. Asking artists to be socially responsible, what an idea. Can artists be socially responsible? Would that kind of defeat the purpose? Anyway, but the social responsibility of art is to be enlightening. Enlighten the public. You're supposed to be helping the public. You're supposed to be socially responsible, meaning you're supposed to be responsible to society. And it would be irresponsible if you mystify the public, wouldn't it? No, the deeper point is that actually you can't. It's not a straightforward matter of this. So again, religion. Okay, so this is the Hegelianism. Religion is a form of enlightenment. It is. It was, and it remains. But it's a deeply ambiguous form of enlightenment, and of course we know that religion serves an ideological function in modern society. But yet, religion making a comeback in capitalism? So why wasn't religion just superseded by bourgeois secular rationalism? Why not? Why wasn't it sublated? Right? So Hegel thought that bourgeois society was going to be a philosophical society that sublated Christianity. That didn't happen. Right? What that means is that if religion lives on in capitalism, why are people reaching for it? Are they reaching for it to conceal their condition? Sure. But they're also reaching for it to try to reveal something about their condition. They are seeking enlightenment through religion. Right? So, and art comes from religion. So something that I mentioned, all writing is scripture. All writing is scripture. The crazy emails from the SAIC about this or that, right? Like, armed robbery on State Street, blah, 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 at 10 p.m., right? Right? That is the voice of God speaking to the children. It is scripture. Thus it is written. Right? Language. Language is something that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be reading an essay called Language as Such and the Language of Man. And we're going to be getting into language of God, Adam's language. But then we don't have the language of God or Adam's language after expulsion from paradise. We don't. We have to invent our language. And then it's no longer the language of God, and it's no longer Adam's language. Okay, so Halakha, Haggadah. All right, so scriptural interpretation. Okay, wait. See, there are many threads. Sorry, many threads. And I know that I dropped the thread on children and guilt. We'll come back to it. Why children exist as punishment, but not as punishment for the parents, although it's also that. But no, life itself is a punishment. Born of sin, original sin, born of sin. Okay, so the Romans conquered the Jews. I was telling my husband, we were talking about this, because we were talking about, of course, Palestine, and my husband's Muslim. I think I mentioned that to you guys, have I mentioned it? Okay, so he's very, right, Al-Aqsa, he is, right? So, you know David and Goliath? Who was Goliath?
A giant.
But who? What tribe? The Philistines. The Philistines. Palestine's named after the Philistines. The Romans named Israel, Palestine, to humiliate the Jews, to undo the victory of David over Goliath. It's very intentional. And then the Ottomans have the Roman name for Palestine. That is what that is. It's as if David didn't defeat Goliath. Because who's David? Yeah, but he's also he's like the king, right? Like he is like the founding king. Like he is the dude, right? And how did he become that? By defeating Goliath, right? The whole thing. So the Romans had to put down the Jews when they rose up, and they destroyed the temple. And the diaspora ensued, right? So there is the Jewish diaspora. So what happens when the temple is destroyed? What happens to Judaism as a religion? So it was a religion like other religions. It had priests. It had priests. What happens after the destruction of the temple? There are no more priests. There are no more priests. What are there instead? Rabbis. Rabbis. And rabbis are not the same as priests. They're not the same as priests. Not at all. Right? So a rabbinic religion is a self-consciously fallen religion. Right? We're still in Egypt. Right? At the synagogue. Every week. We're still in Egypt. We're disconnected from God. And we have to figure it out. And the only means that we have are rabbis, learned men. And how are they learned? The book. Scriptural exegesis, scriptural interpretation. So we don't have access to God, we only have access to Scripture. This is a big deal, right? They just had a new pope, right? He's from Chicago. And there's a conclave, and there are cardinals, and it's in Rome, and they do it under the Sistine Chapel, the Michelangelo, right? Because they are intermediaries with God. It is God's intention that dude from Chicago is pope. Jews don't have that. They do not have that anymore. They did. They do not. So instead they have the book. Now in the bourgeois era, this is significant because Protestantism. What is Protestantism? It's the priests. Yeah. It's a religion without priests. It's a religion without priests. What does that sound like? Oh, the Jews. And in fact, that's what Catholics said. They said, this is the triumph of Judaism. We have to stomp this out. And they accused the Protestants of being... So the Protestants called Catholics idolaters. The Catholics called Protestants bibliophiles. Bibliophiles. Meaning you love the book. But that's a blasphemy. Loving the book is not loving God. Jews know that. They know that they're left with the book, which means that they're spiritually bereft. They know that that's what that represents, whereas the Protestants try to turn it into like a virtue. And yet, obviously, it's enlightened Christianity. It's bourgeois Christianity. Right? But it gives birth to a whole like biblical exegesis thing. Protestantism is all about the study of ancient texts and the provenance of Scripture. It's a whole like industry comes up. And everyone can do it because you put the Bible in the vernacular, you have mass literacy in a way that you didn't have under traditional Catholicism. Okay, so Haggadah Halakha. So once you get the book, and then it's like, what does it mean? Is it law-giving or is it storytelling? Right, these are the two sides of Scripture. parsing the text? Is this telling you how to live, or is it just telling you what happened? Is it descriptive or is it instructive? Right? And this is an endless debate. Like, does this passage in the Bible mean that we have to do just that, what it says? Or is it just telling us what they did back then, but we don't have to do that? What is fiction? Is fiction telling us what to do? Is it normative? Is it prescriptive? Or is it just descriptive? What is it? What is fiction as a moral thing? As a moral piece of writing, what is it? Right? Is it exegetical? Right? Is it in Islam the hadith? Right? So there's the Quran and there's the hadith. And so is it some kind of like, okay, it's not the word of God, that would be scripture. Although we don't know what God's telling us. Is he telling us, what is he telling us? It's the oral tradition written down, it's the story of the tribe, but somehow it's also the word of God. But the hadith is not. The hadith is the word of people. Like, exegesis is the word of people trying to figure out the meaning of the text. So if all language is the voice of God, we'll see what Benjamin has to say about that, with respect to Kafka and also with respect to just language as such. What is this fiction? What is fiction? What is narrative? What is the novel form? What is this secular art form that's emerged? Where it's not like mythic history, it's not the oral tradition, it's not like legends of the tribe anymore. It's not scripture, and yet it still has this power, and it has specific power with regard to enlightenment. Is it telling us what is happening, what happened, or is it telling us how we should live? All right, so this problem attends art in general. What is art doing? Like, when art was religious, they didn't have that problem exactly. They did not. Right? Whereas now, modern artists, it's like, what are you doing? Right? Are you like misleading people? Is it blasphemy? Is art blasphemy? Or is art holy? We're not done with that question. We're not done with that question. Not at all. So that's, if you want to know why Benjamin would do this thing, and also this dialogue with Sholem. Right, and even Kabbalism is like a weird kind of thing too, because it's kind of like, it's offbeat. It's not traditional like exegesis. It's not like, it has a special status. It's mystical. And it is about like hidden meaning, right? So the question is, what do we make of hidden meaning also? Is hidden meaning, is it intended to be hidden, or is it intended to be revealed? Is it intended to be obscured, or is it intended to be revealed? The meaning. Is God hiding his meaning from us? Or is this way of God revealing his meaning to us? Right, that fundamental ambiguity? And so if it's encrypted, if scripture is encrypted, or if fiction is encrypted, who encrypted it? Did the writer encrypt it? Is the encryption the intention of the writer, or is it God's intention? That encryption. That hermeticism, that hiding of the meaning. Is it in language itself? Right, so again, reification. Language is a means to an end. It's for communication, right? But it also can become an end in itself. And what happens to language in the realm of art? So so right, so the purpose of art was to enlighten. What was it supposed to enlighten about original truth? It was supposed to enlighten about God. Is art revealing or is it concealing? Is it enlightening or is it mystical? So, also, I might as well do this, because we'll go around to this later with the language of such and language of man. So what's the name of God? Yahweh. And what does Yahweh mean? It means I am. So it's literally I am that I am. I am that I am. So it's a kind of enunciation of being. So God is like the ultimate being. And also in the beginning was the Word. That's strange. So in some way God spoke himself into existence.
Sorry, the screen behind you like changed right as you did that. It was very dramatic.
Yeah.
That was good.
Screensaver made a divine intervention.
Yeah.
So I am that I am. So did language bring God into existence, or did God bring language into existence? And then how do we make God present? And also, you're not supposed to say Yahweh, right? So you're supposed to know the name of God but not speak it, because that's a blasphemy. Why? Because God says, I am that I am. But if we say it, then we're diminishing that enunciation of being that only belongs to God and not to us. Indeed, an enunciation of being that only belongs to God and not to us. Right? We didn't speak the world into existence, but God did. And yet we still speak. And we still speak things into existence through art and literature, don't we? So in the traditional world, artists don't create anything. God creates it. And the artist is just channeling God's creation. In the bourgeois era, guess what? Artists create things. And when artists did blasphemous things, it wasn't their doing either, it was the devil. No, this is real. Are you guys doing the work of God or the work of the devil? Or are you doing your own work? Ew. That's less interesting. It's much more exciting when it's like God's work or the work of the devil. And the artist is literally in their like studio, like wrestling with themselves. Am I doing the devil's work? Am I doing God's work?
I have one question, like when you asked what fiction is, what about its, I mean, I feel like it's an authoritarian metaphor.
It's an authoritarian metaphor? How so?
I mean, is it?
Fiction. Okay, so here's another Lukács piece. Okay, so Lukács, I think that we talked about psychological realism, right? So the desideratum of the bourgeois novel is psychological realism, but 3 components with respect to that. So one is the psychological realism with respect to the protagonist or characters. The other is the psychological realism of the reader, of course, so fiction should not affront the psychology of the reader. It should make sense in some way. But also the authorial voice. So the voice of the narrative itself. So with what voice does the narrative itself speak? And that's the author's voice, but it's also not the author's personal voice. It's the authorial voice. Right, so when an author writing a piece of fiction, or when a historian writing a work of history says it was, are they making it so? No. Actually, no. In other words, that's not their personal voice speaking. It's, again, the voice of being speaking. It was. Or it is. You know, again, I am that I am, Yahweh. So, that authority is not personal. Now, I mentioned the oral tradition and also Lukács the epic versus the novel. So the epic is literally the story of the tribe, in which case the authorial voice of the epic is the community's voice. It's the collective voice of the community. But that's not simply as opposed to the individual voice of the author, because the individual, of course, only speaks their own individualized, particularized, collective voice of the community. So when each of us speaks, we don't just speak for ourselves, we speak with the collective force of the community. It's built into language itself. Nobody invents their own language. Nobody writes their own language, no. So, again, the authority, even when it's individual, it's collective. But with the novel, you have a tension between the individual voice and the collective voice that doesn't exist in the epic. So even when modern authors, because they do, try to write epics, it's a weird thing. And I mentioned Tolstoy and Dostoevsky as like kind of terminus, crisis of the novel, and then like with what voice are they speaking? You know, so of course Tolstoy writes these historical epics of War and Peace, and yet it's still clearly a bourgeois novel. And yet it's also supposed to be speaking with like the zeitgeist of history. Like it really is about like the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, these Russian people who are caught up in these events. You know, so it is an attempt to reconstruct the power of the epic in the era of the novel, and what that does is it sort of stretches the novel to its limits. And again, Dostoevsky does something somewhat different that's closer to Kafka in this respect, which is this kind of parabolistic, kind of weird, like, okay, what's going on here? What's the significance of these characters? What is this authorial voice? Which Lukács described as already being beyond the novel. Beyond the novel in what sense? In the sense of instantiating a community that didn't yet exist, whereas Tolstoy was trying to restore a community that no longer existed. You know, Tolstoy is this crazy Christian socialist mystic guy and really yearns for that, like restoration of the community. Whereas Dostoevsky is not doing that, and neither is Kafka, although, of course, they're shadowed by this. And I think, did we talk about fragment? We did talk about fragment. The two different ways of looking at the fragment. So the fragment can either be something that was whole and is broken versus something that's incomplete, which is different. And we have to keep the second one in mind, because in fact, that's how Benjamin prefers to see it. Like, so he prefers to see it as something incomplete rather than as something broken, because the broken view is the romantic view. It's the backward-looking view. And so he's like, if modernism has this fragmentary character to it, it's because it's transitional, it's incomplete, not because it's like the broken pieces of something that once was whole, because then what you'd end up doing is try to like put it back together, and there's no point to that. Especially because it never was together, right? So that's the other thing, is that there was never this integral community. No, it was always in motion, it was always changing, right? But from the standpoint of later of the ancestors, of the descendants, it looks like the ancestors lived in this kind of unified world that they didn't, but from our perspective, it looks like they did.
I have a question, and I don't know if this is like too much digressive. What about Elohim, the other name of God?
What is the literal meaning of that?
I don't know.
Isn't that,
One thing I can hear.
Elohim, the other name of God.
Oh.
And the,
that has this, is that the other, that's like a different face of God, isn't it? How do you spell
it's
that one?
E-L-O, yeah. E-L-O-H, whatever the hell's
Okay,
right there.
What is the real meaning of Elohim? Oh, just God? The strong one, the mighty one. Okay. And angels. Yeah, so it has a kind of like, it has more of like that kind of deity kind of intimation. Yeah, Elohim would be more. Okay, so we brought up esotericism, right? So it's kind of like God as God is revealed, and then there's God as like could never be revealed, ever. Like just you could not even, right? Yahweh's more like that, right? Elohim is more like a God, right? And of course we know that from the Old Testament too. When did God become God? Right. When did the God of the Jews become God? Because started out God of the Jews, started out a tribal God. Now I mentioned that Benjamin is a Nietzschean. So Nietzsche is a classical philologist, and what is the classical world, like ancient Athens or ancient Rome? They're polytheistic. I guess Hinduism has this quality as well of polytheism. So what is polytheism? It's just the tribes get together and then all their various gods join the pantheon. So God starts out as the tribal God of this tribe and not anybody else. Not a universal God. Not the creator of the entire world, but the creator of this people here. Right? So there is a transformation that happens that is in Scripture. Like you can track it. When God goes from being the God of the Jews to becoming God. Right? So not a God, but God. Right? So that's important to keep in mind. Right? I was just teaching Kant in my other class, and Kant thinks it's very important in human civilization, monotheism. So basically it's when the gods go from being characters that we relate to, like who basically usually torment us, right? So the gods are terrifying, whereas God is like a companion who can be fearful but is not terrifying. It's an example of the sublime. So basically, like, religion was about terror, and then it became about sublimity. And it's when it becomes sublime that shows that human subjectivity had attained a certain level of its own sense of autonomy and freedom that it didn't have when the gods were these powerful entities that tormented us.
That's why the meaning refers to Kafka's world as prehistorical something, as polytheistic world. Yeah?
So prehistoric, yes. So prehistoric is, it's tricky, right? Because maybe there are two different senses of prehistory. So there's prehistoric, like, imponderable past. And then there's prehistoric meaning pre-modern. And I think he's playing with those. Because although, so it's kind of like the example of the bureaucracy or of the functionaries and the attendants, is that they seem to be completely, imponderably ancient and source of power, and yet they're also clearly like historical, so they clearly have a kind of reality to them that belies that. So it's about how capitalism presents things that are historical as if they're prehistorical. So I mentioned like biological racism as a new thing. It's a new thing in the 19th century. It doesn't really exist before that. Because people could be adopted and cultured and whatever. So there was no like just strict biology. That you get that in the capitalist era, where it looks like people are not from a historical origin and culture, but are from some imponderable biological origin. Reification. You get a reification of race in capitalism. That was not the case before. And yet, it appears like it speaks to some ancient reality, and yet it's a modern phenomenon. Right? So the issue for Benjamin is, why would capitalism exhibit features of the prehistoric? What is that about? And again, this is where Benjamin, so I mentioned the Benjamin, it's Jewish fascism, right? So Brecht didn't like Kafka because he thought that Kafka reified Jewish culture, right? Turned it into this thing that rubbed Brecht the wrong way, and different from Scholem. Scholem's different. So again, like, I'm not sure that Brecht would have been bothered by Scholem to the same extent. Right, so part of the problem is like that they're like struggling over the corpse of Kafka or something, It's like a weird, and again, the status is different because Scholem, Kafka is a fiction writer. So what do they call it? Creative writing? Creative writing, okay. No, there is this creative character to the artist, right? This Promethean character of like making something. And, Benjamin is not that, Scholem's not that. Brecht, however, is. And yet in this funny way that, what is he doing? And we'll talk about that more next week. That he recycles stories, right? In other words, he's a creator who claims to really not be creating anything, which is very peculiar. And Kafka, there's something similar, right? So Kafka has a kind of, there's deep ambivalence in Kafka, where Kafka thinks of himself as being in a certain Jewish tradition, but also thinks of himself as a modern writer. And it's the connection between those two things. And especially through the parable, the idea of the parable. Now, so the big thing is this is all pre-Holocaust. It's a different thing. So why do I say that? Because things are loaded now in a different way than they were in Benjamin's time, and certainly in Kafka's time. So ex post facto, looking back retrospectively, it looks like Kafka's predicting the fate of the Jews in the Holocaust. No, right? He's describing something very modern that nonetheless has some relation to ancient history. Right, again, the rabbinic tradition and what that means, the diaspora. So why do I say that? Because Benjamin will he'll switch between Jewish and Christian references with respect to these kinds of matters of exegesis and revelation, and so because of course to Benjamin's mind Jews in Europe are living in a Christian world, and therefore it's not simply some atavistic Judaism at work. It's some kind of dialogue between Judaism and Christianity that I mentioned is already very present in the bourgeois epoch because of the way the Reformation went, where basically the Catholic Church sort of mobilizes a kind of traditional anti-Semitism against the Protestants. And of course, Protestants, as part of the bourgeois revolution, Protestantism is connected to the emancipation of the Jews. That was not the case under Catholicism. Right, so there's a kind of secularization, there is a kind of, there is an introduction of religious tolerance, in fact, believe it or not, with the Protestant Reformation. And it is about secularizing religious authority, and so it is, there's kind of a deep history here. And so some of the thought figures are going to be Christian in Benjamin, very deliberately so. So that's why when we're tread into theology, it's a very thick realm, it's a very complicated realm, and Benjamin still is a Nietzschean. And Nietzsche has a kind of a wacky view of these kinds of things, like very wacky view. In other words, not anything that any theologian would accept. Like not a Jewish theologian, not a Christian theologian, like would just not accept the Nietzsche story. Benjamin does accept the Nietzsche story because he sees it as like a very arch-bourgeois, like a kind of capturing a truth about religion and modernity and bourgeois society. Right. And Nietzsche, who was he wasn't just Christian, he's the Antichrist, right? So his two persona of Nietzsche are Dionysus and the Antichrist. Whereas really he was Socrates, but he had a disavowed of Socrates. So anyway, how are we doing with time? We should take a short break. Let's take a short break.
Okay.
All right.
Online group. On the first day.
Childhood photograph. This is where you were going with it. Okay, so action becomes image, and we have the justice. And we'll see next time with Brecht, it will be the quotable gesture. Sorry to jump ahead with the references, but they're important. And we're trying to, we have to do things in sequence, but we also have to try to do things in parallel. Right, so photography is a curious phenomenon. We're not doing the media writings by Benjamin, but they exist. So we have the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, but we also have another piece by Benjamin called The Little History of Photography. It's not in any of these books, but I think that I put it on Canvas in the additional readings for our course so that you guys can reference it if you want. I think I did anyway. And so photography is strange as an example. It's totally natural for us. Photography is completely naturalized for us. But for Benjamin, might be into the unfiled. Or did I not put it here at all? Hold on. Oh yeah, this is here, so I don't know what. Alright. Good little history of photography you can find on Canvas. But anyway, the point for Benjamin is that photography is a particular kind of, or example of reified image. And all of that is not necessarily coming to bear here in his treatment of the Kafka photograph, but it's just to keep in mind. And here, let's bring up the. Oops. And it's an old-fashioned photograph. That's what's important, in that it's a studio photograph. And they included it here, but I guess they don't. Okay, hold on. I don't know if you guys looked this up.
The comparison of photograph, studio photograph is torture chamber.
So you guys didn't look it up? No? Okay. Should have looked it up. Okay, so yeah, this is like a genre of photography that's ancient now. It's antiquated. By the time Benjamin is writing, it's very 19th century. So it's very much of a different era. And it recalls like early photography, like daguerreotype photography. So daguerreotypes are long exposure photographs as opposed to the snapshot that we have now, and that we've had since the late 1800s. So what that meant was that people needed to prop themselves up to like maintain a pose for a long period of time in order to do the daguerreotype photography. But that, you know, sort of created a practice that then persisted.
So this isn't a daguerreotype.
It is not. No.
Oh, it is not.
No, it is not.
Yeah.
Yeah, because snapshots they had by the time this was taken. Right, and also Benjamin's understanding of this is that even though initially photography was not a snapshot, it always wanted to be a snapshot. Right, and so although there were experiments done with early photography that took advantage of the long duration, the long duration exposure was something that they were trying to kind of avoid, although it affects the texture of the image. It does. It gives the image a depth as opposed to the snapshot, which is a little flatter. Right. If you guys know about depth of field, anybody do photography? Depth of field. So depth of field is like this funny thing that depends on a great deal of light. Like the more light, the more depth of field. So the effect that has in daguerreotypy is the long exposure actually adds depth of field that's otherwise missing from the snapshot, unless it's like very lit. Okay. Okay, so if you recall from the Proust, what you bring up here, Danny, about dissolving the world into its gestic components. So if you recall from Proust, matter is an aggregate of images, and then Proust would do these sort of thick descriptions of people especially, but also of things that seem to sort of dissolve things into their details. Right, so something very similar is going on with Kafka, except instead of like the physical like attributes, it's dissolving into component actions. And each action, so if action is like a means to an end, each action becomes an action in itself. That's why repetitive actions, repeated actions, or so it also seems that the functionaries or the attendants, right, that their purpose is just to do that action. And so in their physical form, they're kind of reduced to like the action, like their body part that is doing the action. And again, this would resonate with the Marx idea of the worker becoming an appendage of the machine. But in this instance, it would be these people who've become appendages of the state apparatus, the bureaucracy. Right? And so where they're performing a little function, and then even their function dissolves into like discrete actions. Right, so that the way Kafka's describing things, it's like the reader is encouraged to focus not on the figure of the character, but on the actions. Right, where the action is done for its own sake, it becomes an action in itself.
That's what he calls the gesture.
Well, right. So they're done for their own sake, and yet they seem to have a meaning, right? And that's where the gesture or the justice, like it becomes so when action becomes an image, it also becomes a sign, we can say, or it's not as simple. The symbol is like the collision of things. It's like the combining of things. It's more like a discrete sign. So action becoming an image. And again, if you recall that perception, Bergson, the interaction of images, and matter is the aggregate of images, which means that matter is defined by all the potential action that it can be part of. And yet what's happening here is seemingly the reverse operation. So Bergson is sort of taking like matter and sort of bringing it to life, but then also like freezing it in an image. It's like the image becomes a circuit of action. But then Kafka is sort of kind of every action sort of in its own little, in itself character done for its own sake, sort of becomes a thing. And therefore it's like a freezing of the action. So action becoming an image would be the reification of action. So the action becomes an end in itself, and that's what bureaucracy is. Right? Bureaucracy is you just keep people employed at the DMV because you need to have a certain number of people employed, and if the Chicago Democratic Party didn't deliver this number of jobs, then it would create more social problems. And so they have to kind of employ a lot of people. Have you ever had this experience, going to get the driver's license at the DMV? Right, so I actually had the experience of renewing my driver's license recently, and it was not the experience that I used to have. The experience that I used to have was you go up to the counter and you fill out a form, and then that person looks at the form and then they hand it to someone else, who then carries it over and hands it to someone else, and then it goes to the back room, and it's like, wait, isn't there something more efficient than this? But then no, you have to employ 5 people, right, to pass the note. Otherwise, the city of Chicago would fall apart, or the people would rise up and overthrow the Democrats. And we can't have that. So that's what Kafka's describing. He's describing, like, at least I can see the piece of paper. I'm not sure why I have to fill out this piece of paper to just renew my driver's license, but anyway, you could actually, like, okay, like, at least they're kind of, it's being passed along and whatever. But so in Kafka, on the other hand, it seems like, no, it's just sort of, they're just passing the paper around for no particular reason. Right? And so that's the image that we have. And of course, like, sitting at the counter watching this, you're wondering, like, what is it that they're approving? What is this process? So it's happening right in front of you, and yet it's completely opaque in terms of its significance or meaning. That's what the effect, right, is that we're looking at the functioning of the world, and it seems to be according to some purpose, but we don't understand what the purpose is. Well, what is that like? religion, theology. God moves in mysterious ways, meaning everything has a purpose in the mind of God, but we will never understand what it is.
Rather in the mind of capitalism.
In the mind of capitalism, that's right. Although capitalism is a funny thing because on the one hand, it's we put capital in the place of God. On the other hand, God's not supposed to be an automatic subject, right? So it's a total inversion of God in a way. Capitalism is like kind of infernal that way, right? So it's the opposite of like God creating. It's more like the automatic subject that's consuming and destroying. So yeah, I mean that's I realized that I had mistaken the unfolding. I thought it was in the Proust. It's here, right? The unfolding like a blossom versus unfolding like a piece of origami, right? So you're either like elaborating something or you're kind of explaining it. And so explanation means literally to make plain, which means literally to flatten out. All right, so we have the folded paper boat that then you unfold versus the flower, the bud that unfolds with the petals coming out. Right, and so the question is, what does writing do? Which kind of unfolding is writing? Is writing unfolding like a explanation, or is it elaborating like a blossom?
But all writing or Kafka's writing?
Well, all writing. But Kafka's writing, in other words, there's that question, and then there's a question of how it happens in Kafka. Right? So there's like the general question of this ambivalent or contradictory character, and then there's how that happens specifically in Kafka. Right? So different works of literature, different forms of writing, it would happen differently. And yet, there would still be this question. So the parable is, I didn't mention this. So parables, right, the bud turns into a blossom, but it's also that what it's offering to the reader is some kind of explanation. Now, Jesus taught in parables. That's where I was going. So the mixture of Christian and Jewish references is that the Old Testament is not parables. The New Testament is all parables. And in some ways, Jesus' own life is a parable. Right, in other words, it's an infinite mystery why God would give his begotten Son or become man, or what is that? Are they two separate beings, or are they the same being? What is that? Right, so it's a parable that we can never explain. And yet, Jesus was explaining things through his parables. Right, it's Jesus' teachings are delivered in the form of parables. They're meant to explain, and yet it just deepens the mystery. All right, again, the concealing and revealing. Do you guys know this language? This is like from theology and anthropology. Revealed religion? No? This is like old-fashioned stuff. This is like my generation and maybe baby boomer generation. So, like, people get into Buddhism. Why? Because it's not a revealed religion. Yeah, because revealed religion is bad, right?
What does reveal?
Revealed religion means that it's about like how God reveals his will. And so through these kind of things, through happenings, right? So like, Jesus is like a happening. It's like a revelation, right? And so, and that's where we get the term apocalypse from. Apocalypse is also like this kind of revelation. So it's like an event through which we see, God's will demonstrated. And so, The problem being that then that seems to get rid of the mystery, and yet doesn't it deepen the mystery, actually? All right, so again, is every reveal actually a concealing? Is every revelation actually a concealing? It's the 20th century, meaning there's been thousands of years of talk of this stuff, right? Theologians have debated it to death, meaning it's bottomless. It's really bottomless. And so the question is, meaning, well, the point is that it's irresolvable, and yet the way the problem has posed itself has changed. And because Benjamin's a Marxist, it means that he's a Hegelian, which means that Hegel has a funny way of dealing with this, which is that the essence must appear, meaning humanity is motivated by Geist, spirit, which is like what is divine, freedom. So it's a strange kind of inversion of the expulsion from paradise, since the expulsion of paradise is punishment for freedom, meaning humans made the choice to eat from the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge, and they're punished for it. So freedom is the original sin, actually. And then the question is, well, why did God give them the choice if they weren't supposed to take that choice? And that's the deep mystery. That's the deepest mystery, is why did God give us the choice if he didn't want us to take the wrong choice? Maybe he did. Maybe God wanted us to make the wrong choice. And eating the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, which means enlightenment is a sin. Enlightenment is a sin. And yet, God does want us to understand. Right? God gave us reason in order to use it. Right, so, yes, religion is the ultimate Kafkaesque conundrum. All right, so, let's look at the introductory parables. Before the law stands a doorkeeper. To this doorkeeper there comes a man from the country and prays for admittance to the law. But the doorkeeper says he cannot grant admittance at the moment. The man thinks it over and then asks if he will be allowed in later. It is possible, says the doorkeeper, but not at the moment. Since the gate stands open as usual and the doorkeeper steps to one side, the man stoops to peer through the gateway into the corridor. Observing that, the doorkeeper laughs and says, "If you are so drawn to it, just try to go in despite my veto. But take note, I am powerful, and I am only the least of the doorkeepers. From hall to hall there is one doorkeeper after another, each more powerful than the last. The third doorkeeper is already so terrible that even I cannot bear to look at him." These are difficulties the man from the country had not expected. The law, he thinks, should surely be accessible at all times and to everyone. But as he now takes a closer look at the doorkeeper in his fur coat, with his big sharp nose and long thin black tartar beard, he decides that it is better to wait until he gets permission to enter. The doorkeeper gives him a stool and lets him sit down at one side of the door. There he sits for days and years. He makes many attempts to be admired and wearies the doorkeeper by his importunity. The doorkeeper frequently has little interviews with him, asking him questions about his home and many other things. But the questions are put indifferently, as great lords put them, and always finish with the statement that he cannot be let in yet. The man who has furnished himself with many things for his journey sacrifices all he has, however valuable, to bribe the doorkeeper. The doorkeeper accepts everything, but always with the remark, "I am only taking it to keep you from thinking you have omitted anything." During these many years, the man fixes his attention almost continuously on the doorkeeper. He forgets the other doorkeepers. And this first one seems to him the sole obstacle preventing access to the law. He curses his bad luck in his early years boldly and loudly. Later, as he grows old, he only grumbles to himself. He becomes childish, and since in his year-long contemplation of the doorkeeper, he has come to know even the fleas in the fur collar, he begs the fleas as well to help him to change the doorkeeper's mind. At length, his eyesight begins to fail, and he does not know whether the world is really darker or whether his eyes are only deceiving him. Yet in his darkness, he is now aware of a radiance that streams inextinguishably from the gateway of the law. Now he has not very long to live. Before he dies, all his experiences in these long years gather themselves in his head to one point, a question he has not yet asked the doorkeeper. He waves him nearer, since he can no longer raise his stiffening body. The doorkeeper has to bend low toward him, for the difference in height between them has altered much to the man's disadvantage. "What do you want to know now?" asks the doorkeeper. "You are insatiable." "Everyone strives to reach the law," says the man. "So how does it happen that for all these many years no one but myself has ever begged for admittance?" The doorkeeper recognizes that the man has reached his end. And to let his failing senses catch the words, roars in his ear, "No one else could have ever been admitted here. Since this gate was made only for you, I am now going to shut it." Okay. So the law, obviously the law is in the place of like God or divine intention, in this kind of divine place. So it is the secular world, and yet it's not the secular world, right? It's not the historical world, because we have this kind of protracted time that doesn't make any sense. So his purpose is to make an inquiry with the law, and then that becomes his entire life. And so the gate that's preventing him from getting access to the law, or that stands between him and the law, is only for him. So life is about waiting at a door that was made for you, but that you can never go through. Okay. Now the flip side of it, right? There's a converse. The imperial message. The emperor, so a parable runs, has sent a message to you. The humble subject, the insignificant shadow cowering in the remotest distance from the imperial sun, the emperor, from his deathbed, has sent a message to you alone. He has commanded the messenger to kneel down by the bed and has whispered the message to him. So much store did he lay on it that he ordered the messenger to whisper it back into his ear again. Then by the nod of the head he has confirmed that it is right. Yes, before the assembled spectators of his death, all the obstructing walls have been broken down, and on the spacious and loftily mounting open staircases stand in a ring the great princes of the empire. Before all these he has delivered his message. The messenger immediately sets out on his journey, a powerful and indefatigable man, now pushing with his right arm, now with his left. He cleaves a way for himself through the throng. If he encounters resistance, he points to his breast where the symbol of the sun glitters. The way is made easier for him than it would be for any other man. But the multitudes are so vast, their numbers have no end. If he could reach the open fields, how fast he would fly, and soon doubtless you would hear the welcome hammering of his fists on your door. But instead, how vainly does he wear out his strength. Still, he is only making his way through the chambers of the innermost palace. Never will he get to the end of it. And if he succeeded in that, nothing would be gained. He must next fight his way down the stair. And if he succeeded in that, nothing would be gained. The courts would still have to be crossed. And after the courts, the second outer palace, and once more stairs and courts, and once more another palace, and so on for thousands of years. And if at last he should burst through the outermost gate, but never can that happen, The imperial capital would lie before him, the center of the world, crammed to bursting with its own sediment. Nobody could fight his way through here, even with a message from a dead man. May you sit at your window when evening falls and dream it to yourself. Alright, so life is the door made for you that you can never go through. Life is the message sent only for you that you will never receive.
Hope exists, but not for us.
Yeah, the infinite amount of hope enough for us, right. And who knows what that means? You know what I mean? Like, in other words, for us, what's us? Humans, or people living in this time in history, or what? This particular community of people? What?
What do you make of like these like repeating, like the different terraces, the different palaces, the different doors of the keepers? Is there something? 'Cause I immediately think of like repetition and like trying and trying again to get this message, or into the door and you can't access it. But other than like a literary device to be representing that inaccessibility, I assume that there's.
When we imagine it, though, right? So we don't just repeat the words. We also like have this image, and so it does become a kind of I don't know, almost like fractal. It's sort of like a structure that just sort of infinitely repeats, and so you just zoom out and out and out, but it just becomes the same thing. Because he's not making it even out of the inner palace, right? And yet he knows that there's just more of the same, right? So I think it's supposed to give you a sense of vertigo and a sense of, it's supposed to give you a sense of infinity. That's this whole like years, thousands of years stuff, because obviously that's imponderable amounts of time. Yeah, it's supposed to instill a sense of like maybe sublimity, but really kind of dizzying vertigo, I think. I mean, that's the effect it has on me anyway. Or like a I don't know if it's like an Escher drawing where things like repeat and mirror and kind of elaborate through that mirroring. Escher. Yeah, it's the Escher, right. So it has that kind of effect. Especially when you think about it like architecturally. I mean, it's suggested in the first one too, right? There's a doorway and a doorway and a doorway and a doorway, right? Yeah, so it's not just about repetitive language, I don't think. I think it's supposed to be the imagery. Mm-hmm.
Just talking about this repetition, I recalled circling back to Potemkin episode.
Yeah.
So I remembered that Pushkin, he had this anecdote written about Potemkin.
Oh, yeah.
But he had another name, Petushkov or something like that, as this clerk who went and made Potemkin.
Oh, instead of Shivalkin, yeah.
Yeah, instead of
Right.
Shivalkin, yeah. So, and when you compare the way Pushkin writes and the way Benjamin writes, you can see that Benjamin, he continues to act like chameleon to the subject, to the objects that he writes about. Yeah. So here he adds in his episode this continuity of halls and cabinets that he processes through, and he puts Potemkin not in his office, in his cabinet, but in his bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, Benjamin is very sensitive to this architectural surrounding. And this repetition of spaces that Kafka has.
Kafka does that too in his writing.
Yes, he replicates.
Especially in the novels. Like, there's a lot of like impenetrable architecture. We read on transience for World War One. So Lenin, what did Lenin say about World War One? It tore apart the Gothic lacework of European civilization. Especially in Eastern Europe. Especially in Eastern Europe, obviously. Okay. What else are we missing?
Yeah, I feel like what we've been talking about is very relevant to these questions that I'm already having. Like two of them, they are related to shame and to also. Wait, I have to remind myself what was right.
Okay.
And to the law, to the justice and corruption. I think Benjamin has a very interesting. He made a very interesting logic from Kafka's from Kafka's literature. It's like corruption seems to be the key to justice in this devastating system.
Right.
So my questions are,
Well, okay, so let's think of the trial, right? So in the trial, do you guys know the story of the trial? Okay, so he Joseph K. hears that he's been accused of something. And then he tries to find out what he's being accused of. And in trying to find out what he's been accused of, that's how he becomes targeted and guilty, actually. Right? So then he's guilty of like asking what he's being accused of. And then that's like the crime. And then of course he dies. Right? He's killed, but he's sort of offed, like he's not like tried and executed. No, he's like just killed on the street at the end. Right, and then it's not even clear whether he was killed by the powers that be or not, or whether it's just like a random murder. Right? Asking about your guilt makes you guilty. Like wondering about your guilt makes you guilty. Inquiring about it makes you guilty. So I brought up the Oedipus complex and neurotic guilt. Right, the superego, the father. Right, so who's guilty? That's what really the issue. The issue is filial piety. So children are made to feel obligated to their parents out of a sense of guilt and shame for their existence. Right, so they have to sort of earn, their parents' forgiveness. But in fact, it's the opposite. Right, so in other words, actually the parents are guilty for having brought the child into the world, and of course it's the shame of the parents and the bottomless guilt that they can never atone for bringing the child into the world, and yet the parents are able to pull this trick on the child and flip it, and the child feels like they're to blame for what is actually their parents doing. Right, so I always say this, you don't owe your parents anything. They owe you everything. You do not owe your parents anything. It's their fault, it's their doing, they're responsible. They owe you infinitely, they owe you. You do not owe them anything. Can we accept that? Because that's the reality. And yet somehow culture is built on the unacceptability of that reality. All cultures have flipped the script on the children. And indeed, religion There's another Nietzscheanism. Religion begins with this. Begins with ancestor worship. That's the first form of religion. It's based on this flipping the script, on cosmic guilt of the parents towards the child. All culture, all religion, all civilization is based on this. Instilling in the child a sense of guilt and obligation to their parents and ancestors that is actually, in fact, the reverse. Right, so that's a funny one. Meaning, truth in all cultures, in all civilizations, is actually the opposite of the real truth. So the truth is the inversion of the truth. The inversion of the truth is true. Because after all, that's how we keep this whole thing going. Right? We would, if we didn't feel obligated towards our parents and ancestors, then we would just revert to an animal state. And of course, we don't want to do that. Religion is the source of the distinction between man and animal. Without that, like that's the source of culture. Without that, then we're just animals, and then of course, there's just nothing. Right? And is that paradise or is that hell? Right? Would that be being released from the obligation of meaning, or would it be the ultimate hell of non-meaning?
Can this be somehow linked to what Benjamin writes about animals in Kafka's novels?
Zoomorphism. So here's another connection between Kafka and Nietzsche, which is that they both engaged in zoomorphism. So anthropomorphism, you guys know, that's when you give animals human-like features. Zoomorphism is when you give humans animal-like features. So, it's not a projected humanity onto animals, but it's rather a projection of animalism onto humans. So zoomorphism, right? Interpreting humans as animals, which Nietzsche did. And Nietzsche also, it's about becoming human, right? So we're not human, we're always becoming human. And each form of humanity sees the previous form of humanity as not quite human, but animal. Right, so the aristocratic culture before bourgeois society was not quite human yet, because it was animalistic. It was about birds of prey. It was about predators and prey. Right. And then the question is, how did we go from that situation, might makes right, to humanism and equality? How did that happen? And that's a complicated story. And so it's never a matter of being human, it's always a matter of becoming human. And like I said, history bears, it shows that the latest form of humanity regards all prior forms as not quite human. And that's the point of the zoomorphism. Now with Kafka, it's a little bit different, right? Because Kafka is trying to kind of step to one side of historical progress, and so it's not about reverting to an animal state, it's rather about a non-human state. And that's why the attendants and the functionaries are also like animals. So they just exist. They exist for their own sake. They just are. And that gives them a kind of divine status that humans lack. Right, so the zoomorphism in Kafka has another quality to it, which is that it's sort of not subhuman, it's just non-human. Right, it's not like superhuman, nor is it subhuman, it's non-human. So it's like a different kind of existence that seems to be free of the obligations. So we read Josephine the Singer. So we read Metamorphosis, and we read Josephine the Singer. So Metamorphosis, they both have this quality, although Metamorphosis is about the guy turning into a bug. But maybe he was a bug already at his job, right? Maybe he was a bug already. And then he just became what he already was. But then in becoming the bug, he also is free of his obligation, right? Because he's the breadwinner of the house. He's the breadwinner of the family. And then when he's killed, he doesn't just die, he's killed. Then so you guys know, okay, so short story, we didn't cover this. So if novel is in the Bildungsroman mode of like the essential arc of action by which the protagonist becomes themselves, short story has a different structure. So short story ends with the plot twist at the end. So there's a twist in the end that reveals that the story you thought you were reading is actually a different story than what the actual story was. So with the metamorphosis, it's the girl coming of age, and then the parents are like, oh, we have another source of income. We could marry our daughter to a rich guy. She's pretty. Right? And so again, it's like, oh, the parents are just these, kind of parasites. They're living off the labor of the son, and now they're going to live off the marriage of the daughter, right? So, in other words, you thought that it was about the tragic, happening and failure in his responsibility of K, right? Because he wakes up and is a bug. But actually, it's about the parents and how they're using the children, right? And that sort of reveals the action in a different way. Josephine the Singer doesn't have that twist at the end, but it does have a kind of unexpected ending, which is that it's not merely a metaphor, meaning the mouse folk, they really are not human, right? So it's not like, oh, if we tell the story of humanity, but in the form of mice. No, they're actually not at all human, right? And the metaphor there has to do with, or the parable there has to do with art itself, because she's the singer, but she's the only mouse that sings, and yet don't all the mice sing? And yet haven't we just made her into the singer, even though she's not doing anything different or special? And then we will miss her, but then we won't miss her because nothing really happened anyway. She wasn't doing anything special anyway, but we kind of forgave her indulgence and her kind of self-importance, and then ultimately all of that will be redeemed by her being completely forgotten. And I think the way Kafka puts it is, since we are no historians, the mice, since we are no historians, she will rise to the heights of redemption and be forgotten like all of her brothers, like all the other mice. And also he's got some descriptions of the condition of mice, that they suffer sudden catastrophes, there's a flood, they're all drowned, right? So again, it seems like they're kind of like humans in animal guise, but then actually no, they're not human, and that's the point. And that's Benjamin's point about the animals in Kafka, is that they're not human. In which case, why are we speculating on that existence? How are we relating to these things that are not? Next time we come back to Kafka in 2 weeks, we'll read The Cares of the Family Man and The Hybrid, a Sport, which is about the Odradek and about the lamb kitten, right? Who's the animal that's so pathetic that it would be a mercy to just slaughter it. But we'll come back to that. I'm always missing our 15 minutes. So you guys know, or you don't know. So it used to be, our canonical hours used to be 1 to 4. So it used to be 3 hours instead of 2 hours and 45 minutes. I'm always missing our last 15 minutes. Shame at what? Shame at existence, right? So again, Benjamin is dealing with the Freudian interpretations of Kafka, which is a sort of banalization of both Kafka and of Freud, but nonetheless there is obviously a reason for it all, and also that Kafka is a contemporary of Freud. So Freud thought that neurosis was driven by guilt, but also more profoundly shame. Right, so the unknown family question. So there's filial piety, there's that kind of family, but then there's the question of the family that we belong to that remains unknown to us. Right? And that has to do more with, of course, society. So society, again, in anthropological terms, and again in Freudian terms, would be like an elaboration of kinship. So the family would be the essential model of like the whole society, that you'd elaborate society from the unit of the family. But in fact, that's what Kafka is saying can't be done or apprehended in modern society. So in modern society, we're all kind of members of this unknown family, and then that becomes like, this is what becomes of humanism, right? So we're all members of the human race, human species, and yet that remains the unknown family, right? It's not a knowable. Right? So, in other words, who do we have an obligation or responsibility towards, and who, before whom do we have a sense of guilt and shame? It doesn't elaborate from the family situation, especially because the family situation that Kafka depicts defies that, like in the Metamorphosis. It's like, no. So rather, it's society more generally. So it's the authority. I think, Lena, you brought this up earlier, the question of authority. Like, where's the authority? The authority is more general, and yet that also makes it completely elusive and unfathomable, right? So it's the kind of, bureaucracy is an impersonal authority as opposed to a personal authority. Like, it's defined by its impersonal authority. And of course, capitalism is also defined by its impersonal authority. Meaning, unlike traditional civilization where authority was personalized, it took the form of personages, aristocratic lords, priests, that modern society is specifically impersonal in its authority, and yet there is this pre-bourgeois, pre-modern, pre-capitalist example of that, which is bureaucracy. And so is bureaucracy ancient, or is it modern? And what is the relation between the ancient and the modern? And if it's both ancient and modern, maybe it's something about the human condition more fundamentally, more primordially. In which case, it would be about guilt and shame before God. It would take us back to that place. And Freud's interpretation of God is that it's just an elaboration of parental authority. Right? And yet, that's not an entirely satisfactory answer that Freud gives for why people believe in God and how they think of God. Right? That it would all be traceable back to the family dynamics that the child experienced is not really a fully satisfactory answer. Right? And so raises the larger cosmological questions, but also the societal questions. Right? So bourgeois society was supposed to be a society that didn't need personal authority, and capitalism kind of flips that into something where we would rather it be personal authority, because otherwise we have this impersonal authority that torments us. And where we're not even particularly targeted, we're just sort of accidental victims of things that have taken on a life of their own. Right? Because obviously if we're targeted by people, then that would mean struggling. It would give meaning in a way that modern society eludes that. It defies that possibility of ascribing meaning, and so we're left instead with, why was I even born? Why do we live at all? What is the meaning? Why did God put us here? I think this gets to your other point, deferral. Right, so There is an interpretation available of there's an infinite amount of hope, but not for us, which is that maybe the hope is in the future. Like maybe there's an infinite amount of hope, but not for us now, but for those who come after. Right. In other words, is what kind of a message is Kafka sending to the future? And again, as scripture, if we bring in the theological and the scriptural, how would an emancipated society of the future look back on Kafka? So,
I think Benjamin sort of talked about it later, about like people can only understand Kafka when they're being dual. That's the words he's using, which I'm not sure like. So it has to do with World War II.
Right, right. So he said it about Proust. He's saying it about Kafka. He's going to say it about Baudelaire, which is that they're forerunners. In other words, that they're anticipating something. And they're anticipating something critically, meaning that they're anticipating like a kind of fulfillment of something that is only incipient in their own time. And so in that way, it's a kind of apocalyptic or dystopian kind of image. And yet that also gives them a kind of, they're key to the historical dynamic, right? Because they're sort of, 10 years after his death, but more time than that since he was writing. He's also writing about Proust like almost a generation later. And then Baudelaire will be over a whole historical interval later. This is something that we'll come back to when we get to translation, which is that literature is of its own time, like it's very much of its own time, but it also is really about its afterlife, like it's surviving its own time. So the meaning of literature is something that unfolds historically, it's not instantaneous. Meaning Kafka has gained meaning with the passage of historical time rather than losing it. Which is what you'd think. If you think that literature is the product of its own time, then you'd think that as you get distance from it, it would lose meaning, but no, it gains meaning. And that's a very important concept in Benjamin, the idea that literature accrues meaning in time, it has an afterlife, it lives historically. Right, that what defines art and literature is precisely that it acquires more meaning with the passage of historical time rather than losing it. And that doesn't mean abandoning the fact that it is also its own moment. Right, it's a kind of crystallization of its own moment. Right, so what's being suggested here is a way of understanding history and its dynamics. And how literature can give us access to that in a way that reportage or ex post facto narratives may not. Okay, so retrospective history might not give us what Proust and Kafka can give us about their own time. That's going to be obviously crucial to the Arcades project and why he chooses Baudelaire as his informant for the Arcades project, meaning that how and why it is the case that Baudelaire can give us meaning about the 19th century that the 20th century retrospective history cannot give us. Right, but not just because it's like of its moment, but because of the after effects that it's bound up with. Yeah, so did the world become Kafkaesque because of Kafka? No. And yet it can kind of appear to be the case. And that brings us maybe to our final point. Are writers prophets? Yes. How? Why? How? Why? And is it their doing, or is it the doing of the descendants? All right. Next week, correct. Oh, one last thing I'll say. Baal. David Bowie did Baal. So you can find Baal. If you want to like see Baal performed and see the songs from Baal sung, David Bowie did Baal for a BBC TV play. It's wild. It's decent. It's not a bad interpretation. And it's also an act of self-criticism on the part of David Bowie that he casts himself as Baal. So it's kind of cool that way.